Thank you all for being here today and sticking around all day. I appreciate it. And I'd like to thank my chair, Brian Kelly, and Carl Dupuy for their pointed criticism and advice over the past year. So thanks for that. So 10 years ago, I visited Lexington Market for the first time, and I thought to myself, where is all the food? As the market was then, as it is now, a series of bodega-like stalls selling chips and candy, fried chicken stands, and vacancy. Out of 97 stalls, 35 are vacant. Only 10 sell fresh meat, fish, or produce. This is the central market of Baltimore, a place where I expected to find abundance, but found scarcity. So this thesis is about food. It's about how to replenish an abundance of good food in the city, of availability and access in Baltimore. A lot of neighborhoods don't have access to good food, instead replaced by snacks and junk food. And these food deserts affect 18% of the population in Baltimore, including, ironically enough, the neighborhoods directly west of the market. But why is our food so scarce in the city? Part of the problem is that our food is grown far, far away. This is a graphic from 1924, and as you can imagine, we've only gotten more global since then. This creates two big problems. One, we're distancing ourselves from the food that we eat, from our knowledge about what's available in nutrition, and also it's placing an enormous carbon cost on each bite that we take. But our urban history from the Roman castrum, at least through the Garden City movement, has been based on some degree of self-sufficiency, not on a global food system, where a dense urban core is surrounded and fed by farmland, which is then surrounded by forests and rivers and lakes and stuff, nature. But as our cities have grown in the last 100 years, that farmland's been replaced by sprawling suburbs, which has replaced our nature with farmland to feed everyone. And this is a trend that can't continue indefinitely. In the next 30 years, 2.5 billion people are going to enter the earth. If this were to continue, we'd have no nature left and everyone would be hungry. Cities require an enormous amount of land outside of themselves to feed themselves. Here, DC and Baltimore, roughly equal-sized cities, require 5 or 6 times their land mass outside of themselves to be fed. Now compare that with New York, a slightly larger city, but so much more dense that the actual land taking to feed the city is just enormous. Now, does that food have to come from far, far away? And of course the answer is no. Isn't it possible to densify our food production just like we have housing in cities like New York? Effectively turning the paradigm of the city surrounded by the farm to one of the farm surrounded by and providing for the city. And this is urban agriculture. Now, 3 main types of urban agriculture. One is the edible landscape, where tree line boulevards become orchards. Food is ripe for the picking all around you. The second is personal plots of land, where you're feeding your family, community gardens and backyard gardens, or the sustenance garden. And the third is a super productive indoor farm, or vertical farm, where we're feeding a large amount of people in a very small amount of space. And we do this through really increased efficiencies. Most of our farmland is monoculture farming, which we use as a baseline. We have rows and rows, acres and acres of one product. If we take that and put lots of crops, different types of crops together, it's intensive soil farming. So we have in our backyard gardens or community gardens, we can get 3 times the output. We bring that indoors using hydroponics, it can increase by 14 times. When we stack these hydroponic systems, the sky's the limit. So I found a perfect site for this idea of bringing agriculture into the city in Lexington Market as a way to both revive a struggling piece of public infrastructure and show the efficacy of bringing a super productive landscape into the city. The market is in the shadow of downtown, roughly between Utah and Green Streets, and just a few blocks north of the Inner Harbor and Camden Yards. The market was not always as it is today. For about 100 years, actually 150 years, the market was a series of blocks, a series of buildings in the street. And this market worked. And it worked because it was extremely porous, it was surrounded by associated retail and commerce, and it was something other than the typical block. It existed within public space. In the 1940s, this market burned down and was replaced by what we know today, which is a nearly windowless brick warehouse surrounded by parking structures with very little retail frontage and physically cuts off Lexington Street. You'll see it's a huge change. The market sits on a hill, where Paca Street in the center is the crest at 25 feet above both Green and Utah Streets. And it's extremely well connected. It's within a block of both mass transit lines in the city. The metro entrance is right across the street, and 1 block over on Howard are 2 light rail stops. The gray area here is the site for this intervention. And the first thing I wanted to do was to better connect this to the city by reintroducing Lexington Street and adding a new pedestrian plaza in the street, connecting the light rail stops in Howard and Utah and Green Streets at their level underneath Paca Street. The new market exists within those two, or between those two, effectively absorbing the grade change, where a single first floor connects both of these blocks, and at the crest of the hill on Paca Street, you can either enter a second floor or a rooftop demonstration garden that totaling over an acre. Surrounding the market are 4 vertical farm towers, with an output of over 70,000 pounds of food per day, feeding 30,000 people a year. And these towers are connected via basement level to a central distribution center, bringing this food all around the city, and a biogas digester, which is creating energy from waste. Great idea, Carl.
That's from the local brew pub, right?
Yeah. Now, surrounding these 4 towers is 850 units of housing, which is doubling the population of the area a quarter mile around the market, and providing an energetic user base to make this a nice, lively, mixed-use district. Now, all 3 together, the market, housing, and vertical farm, represent the producer and consumer coming together on site. And in fact, food is grown, sold, cooked, and eaten on site, which is a great linear relationship. But if it's going to be a sustainable, symbiotic relationship, it needs to be cyclical whenever possible. So, by taking the waste from each of these user groups, clippings from the vertical farms, unsold goods from merchants, restaurant waste, and organic household waste, feeding it through a biogas digester, we're creating heat, energy, and compost that, with recycled water found on site, is all of the inputs that we need to grow food here. Now, before we get into the specifics of the market, I'd like to take a look at the typical block, which essentially is the farm surrounded by the city. The interior of the block is a vertical farm, and the edges are given away to housing units. They're giving light, air, and views to the people on site. The vertical farm has ample glazed frontage, and light wells bring light into the building, which is also creating a cyclical flow from seed to growing to harvest, and that repeats itself indefinitely. Light exists in a gradient in these towers because they're hidden behind housing blocks. But we can use that to effectively program what food is grown where. So the plants that need the most light are grown on the upper floors. Plants like kale that need very little light are grown on lower floors.
And shrimp don't need that.
Yeah, fish and shrimp.
Yeah,
Just
mushrooms.
mushrooms, things like that, all on the lower floors, yeah. Or, when parking becomes unnecessary in the future, all the parking garages now, mushroom growing area. Or charcuterie cure rooms. So these 4 blocks here are the actual footprint of these towers. But because this is stacked growing space, both several floors and stacked within floors, the actual growing area is this big, effectively the size of Patterson Park, for reference. Now, we take into account a 365-day growing cycle, and the increased efficiency with hydroponics and a controlled indoor environment. The effective growing area, or the offset of outside farm area, is this big, which is actually 4% of the city's need, which is huge. Now, if you remember the old market and why it worked so well, it was extremely porous. It was something other than the typical block. It existed within public space. The new market is analogous to this. It's a long linear building made of repeatable, navigable modules that spill out into a public plaza with retail on the other side. And within that market are nearly 100 stalls of varying sizes, from 75 square feet to 150, 300, or 600, and a few independent restaurants off to the side that are even larger. And these stalls can be aggregated or moved around so that the market can evolve as it needs to over time. This is just within the market. The market can also spill out into public space and take at least 160 temporary stalls, so this area can absorb things like the very popular JFX Farmers Market downtown every Sunday. So if JFX were to go away, as some people have suggested, it can be here. So the market itself, as I said, is a series of repeatable modules. And in between those modules is a thickened fauché zone, a thickened wall, and that's the structure of the market, but it also includes all of the building services. So besides the structure, we have partition walls separating stalls, and within those partition walls, we hide refrigerators, shelving, trash collection. In the sandwich of the structure, we had HVAC ductwork, or hood exhaust from fume hoods in restaurants, includes skylights, and rainwater collection all exist within this fauché zone. And that structure within the market, and actually within the whole district, is mass timber, specifically CLT, DLT, and glulam columns and beams. And the standard CLT sheet, 13 by 39, was used to inform the housing dimensions of the housing blocks surrounding the market, where each unit is 1 or 2 or 3 of these standard sheet modules, letting the CLT floors and partition walls become an 8-crate matrix stabilized by CLT shear walls spanning several floors. The vertical farm, similarly simple, glulam column and beam structure with CLT floors, and the glazed portions of the vertical farm are a double envelope of glass, so we have a maximum amount of light coming in with a minimal amount of heat loss and increased control over our indoor environment. The first floor of the market, you can see our sandwich structured fauché zone marching along, and those are connected by what's essentially a wooden waffle slab holding up the roof. And where this market is 2 floors, we have a pitched roof where the ceiling is a DLT sheet with embedded skylights that are just openings in that sheet. And these skylights aren't windows in the roof, but are rather the places where the ceiling doesn't exist, because above that DLT sheet is a continuous glass envelope. This makes a more elegant solution for getting light in here. The market is a centerpiece of the new sustainable food district. It's a gateway to downtown rebirth and is a shining example of integration of our food systems in cities. Thank you. Real quick before we take questions. On the bottom we have our first floor, which is the level of Green Street on the west and Utah on the east, the continuous first floor. Above that, the second floor of the market, which is ground level at Paca Street. So we enter either into the second floor or onto a demonstration garden on the rooftop. And above that is a typical housing block of the 2 blocks north of the market. We have the vertical farm surrounded by housing. This section is cut directly through long ways the center of the market, from Green Street to Paca Street to Utah, where we have our Metro Underground. Over here, I have a model I can pass around of 2 typical bays with a fair amount of detail in there, so have at it.
Maybe you should say something about how much carbon is sequestered with the construction.
A lot. Yeah.
So how many people could live in this?
Space for 2,000 residents.
Only 2,000?
850 units, but growing area to feed 30,000.
850 units and none of them are like apartments for 4 people?
Yeah, well, some of them are, but some of them will be
So
micro units
total-
also.
so
So on
2,000.
average.
So each
yeah.
tower has how many units in it?
Well, there's, I think, 12 different towers, and they vary. Each block has a couple of towers that are, 15 to 18 stories in some places, and also a, single loaded bar building that has a terraced roof, so that there's several occupiable rooftops that can be sustenance gardens and community rooms for people that are living there. So they vary. But the 2 northern blocks we show here are the most dense, and they get a little less dense as we go on the block on the south.
Could you walk us through your perspectives?
Yeah. This first one, we're in the public plaza, looking towards the market from Utah Street.
Can you show us on the plan where
Yeah, so here we're standing, we're here looking towards the market. Second one, we're in the first floor of the market. We have second floor above. Third one, sorry. We're on a balcony on the block on the south, looking at Packard Street. So that water tower is the centerpiece on Packard Street. We can see the demonstration garden and the 2 blocks beyond that we see in elevation here. And this last one, we're at the level of Packard Street on our second floor, sort of retail promenade, looking down into the public plaza. So that last one is taken from here by this grand stair, looking this way. And below there's a shot of the second floor of the market, from here.
So can you point out where the towers are? Where are the towers on your plan?
Here where we have all these sort of marching along things, these are, grow stacks. So this is one, and this is one. And there'll be one on another block we're not seeing, and across the street also.
Okay.
I just want to say that you are to be congratulated on a wonderful presentation and an interesting topic and a interesting solution for farming in the cities. It's something that, like you pointed out, it is a problem, and this is definitely a very interesting approach. I think that bringing the typology of the market back, similar to what it used to be, but with a twist, is another great approach. My question to you is more on structure and the choice of wood, especially on those towers. I would like you to explain that to me, because I find that to be a little difficult to understand at this point.
Okay, so I made sure that the housing towers topped out at 18 floors, which is the maximum in the new IBC for mass timber construction. And we're basically making the demising walls between units be part of the structure. So instead of having a column grid that goes up, yeah, it's a load bearing, yeah. And together, even if they don't all line up together, they all form a stable matrix. And then having a shear wall basically placed in front of that, which is spanning 3 or 4 or 5 floors, stabilizes it from racking back and forth.
So why did you choose that instead of a more conventional mode of construction, like a steel structure or concrete structure?
That's a good question, and I think it comes down to what I think the future of best practice is going to be with building in cities, and that mass timber is going to be best practice very soon.
Carbon sequestration.
Yeah, it's all about carbon sequestration.
I was hoping you're going to tell me that wood is the only building material that grows, right? So.
Well, that's true, yeah.
This is a fantastic thesis presentation. It's so clearly drawn. I love that. And it's working at the big scale and it's working at the small scale. It's just fantastic. And you're really to be congratulated on that. I really have just 2 comments. One is on the residential units at the towers. It's terrifically inefficient housing. And I'm wondering why it couldn't be more developed, denser. In other words, is there a reason why this corridor couldn't come along and this become a double-loaded wing that then turns up and you could do with half the elevators and half the stairs?
So I struggled with this at the beginning a lot because obviously double-loaded is going to be the most efficient, and they can sort of stack these together and I could fit probably twice as many units per area that I did. There's 2 reasons that I did it this way. And one is that each block has a sort of central courtyard that's a level above the public space here. So we have a sort of cascading levels of public space going from the most public to the most private public space, sort of cascading down towards the market. And keeping a visual connection there I thought was important. And secondly, while also dealing with visual connection, is that I wanted to have sort of the elevator lobbies and hallways, wherever possible, have a visual access directly into the vertical farms, so people that are living there can see what's being grown, next door. So I have it set up where you exit the elevator and you're looking through glass window into the vertical farm so you can see what's going on in there.
And I see the push and pull between all those things. I just think in order to ever build this, you would need to get much more housing and maybe just have a single window in a corridor into the thing, not a whole glass wall into the greenhouse. Something, you're going to have to
Sacrifice romance for
in the next
cash.
step.
Yeah.
Well, the right size, just right size. And my only other comment is the skylights, or the lack of skylights, but the openings in the ceilings in the market area. I think the light pattern falling on wares that are being sold would drive the retailers crazy. They really want just even light, and they don't want direct light probably hitting the food. So maybe there's a more general way to bring light through. But it was an interesting idea to just cut the ceiling out. Maybe it's more of a continuous slot within a baffle or something.
It's a wonderful place for bird nesting now.
Right. So back to the CLT structure of the vertical farm.
Yes.
I'm very curious about that because I would imagine that that thing is incredibly wet.
Yeah, so I talked just about CLT, but really there's a lot of concrete involved also.
Okay.
And so the basic structure, floors is a series of CLT sheets, but then they would have a 2-inch concrete floater on top, which is
Okay.
pretty standard.
So you did think about that.
And
That's
then
good.
the cores, we can see, elevator, and we have a sort of the zone, storage room, and the light well are all in the zone, can be concrete instead of wood also, which is our stabilizing factor through the whole building.
Did you actually do a light study? You showed that diagram of the plants. You showed that diagram of the plants, tomatoes on top and fish at the bottom and so forth. Did you actually do a light study to see where the light, depending on how the building is oriented, where the light falls?
Yeah, and actually I started with the plan view kind of to determine where I was going to put the other things that we need, so elevators and storage space and a pump room and things like that, by showing where light is going to hit and say elliptical shape around the light wells that we have and the openings, so we can see like what's the most light profitable area that we don't want to be putting an elevator in or a stair in. And the same in section. Although the problem is that when you're stacking produce 20 feet tall on these racks, is that that's what's obstructing the light the most. So you really only get really good light on the stuff that's really up against the windows, and the rest of it is supplemented by artificial lighting, LEDs. But then still, upper floors still get a lot more light, and actually the top floor is basically a greenhouse, so great for tomatoes, and underneath that. Stuff that still has artificial lighting, but not as much as you would need if it was on the bottom floor.
It would be nice to know the embodied energy of a tomato grown here versus one grown in rural Virginia and versus one grown in California and shipped here. It's a way beyond what I would expect.
Yeah, including all the transportation and stuff like that
At
required.
some point, it's going to balance out a bit.
Right, so what your project really is, and by the way, I think the beginning of it was really fascinating, the city surrounding the farm. So, what you're talking about is really the end of nature, right? I've read this thing about how nature needs our assistance now, that nature can't take care of herself anymore. And that's really what you're talking about here, is how do we, I love that cyclic drawing that you had of the waste and the growing and all of that. So I think, the ideas here are really tremendous and very interesting, and I think at some point will be practical. I'm not sure that day is today, but I think it will come. And the urban design, I did not know the history of Lexington Market and why it's so horrible now, but clearly this is much better. I think that the next thing for you to do, because I really think it's a great start, but would be to work on the architecture of the buildings, which I find actually really not convincing. The housing seems a little overly complicated to me, at least at this level. I just think that these elevations need more work. I do think as a type, surrounding this incredibly, cool glassy farm in the middle is kind of incredible. I mean, it's really great. But I do think that, it would just be the next layer of study, that's all.
Beautiful project and a very powerful idea. I can't help but think that Amy's point that there's kind of this push and pull between the housing and the vertical farm, and so I'm sure that you developed that bulk based on light you needed with the hole in the middle. I wondered if you tried a tower that's just exposed on 4 sides. And you do have farming where you have 2 exposures for some areas, right? You've got the hole in the middle of the courtyard, plus you've got the perimeter.
Yeah.
And that, so I want to believe that, well, I think the housing, there needs to be more housing, and perhaps that shrinks the towers, but I want to believe that those towers are going to look like that, and perhaps even more colorful. So speaking to your elevations, I think there's a richness to that facade through the different glass types and through what's behind it that's not revealed in your elevations. The tectonics of the market building are really quite wonderful. You put so much thought and care into those and giving us these nice diagrams. When I look at the interior, I get that market feel, but what's missing for me is the food. What I'm seeing, it looks like pop-up restaurants, not necessarily stalls of food. And so when I think of like Pike's Place Market, which is just full of food, flowers, it's just all this. I think was the genesis of your idea, and certainly the old images of Lexington Market, where it's just, there's people and food. You almost don't notice the architecture, but the architecture you've made is quite beautiful. So, nice job.
I agree. I think the market structure is really compelling. I can tell you put a lot of thought into that. I want to zoom out 50,000 just to talk about the vertical farm and the ideas rooted there. I was also really fascinated by the presentation in the beginning, but also super skeptical. So I'll say you put together the most convincing presentation for a vertical farm that I've seen. But I want to push back just because I think it's an interesting conversation. Have you seen the movie The Biggest Little Farm?
I haven't.
It's really cool, but the idea is that it takes 7 years to incarnate a farm that grows food and doesn't require a lot of maintenance or irrigation, a farm that's like the permaculture you described. And the reason is because it takes 7 years to build an ecology, a whole ecosystem. So when I look at the vertical farm that you designed, it is a lot like the monoculture farms that are created that are really lacking a kind of like depth and an ecology of all the animals and microorganisms. So I'm just wondering, I also appreciate that diagram that you did of the system diagram. I'm just wondering if there's a way of thinking about this vertical farming as a new kind of urban ecology. It's not going to be what the farms are. It's not going to attract the weasels and the foxes and all that, right? But might it attract certain birds, like owls, who will eat the mice? Might it attract other insects like bees? Is there a way you can think about this really quite beautiful glass system that you've designed as something that's more permeable? And that the vertical farm, you give it 7 years to really understand what it needs to be a sustainable urban ecology. And maybe you're growing like weedy plants, that are edible too, right? Or maybe it's not necessarily hydroponics, but it's all about the species palette. So I just want to add that to it, and I think if you went there for your portfolio, probably those vertical farms would start looking a lot messier, which is good, And then maybe actually quite a beautiful contrast to the pristine market building and the CLT that you've created. And I like the cleanness, like I see that as the architect's mind, and I'm convinced by that. But I want the messy ecology too.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And speaking to this sort of schism in the idea of like the future of food, if it's a technological advancement, which is the vertical farm, as I've designed it at least, which is a sort of controlled environment, and then the other side of that being a reversion back to what used to work, over 100 years ago, back when we used to feed ourselves seasonally. And in order to sort of address both of these concerns, I try to do both on site, where the vertical farm is its one thing, as you described, non-ecological place where we're efficiently growing food, but sort of without that added ecological benefit. The other part being an acre of, outside demonstration garden that we have available to the public, and then the terrace rooftops that are sort of outdoor gardens, and that's the place where you can approach that 7-year farm and let it be a more wild, ecological place where we're growing food.
Were there precedents and case studies for this sort of vertical farm? Any kind of critical dimensions or anything like, because again, you did give a lot of real estate to the vertical farming component of the site. So I'm curious what kind of examples you looked at.
Yeah, so obviously nothing like at this scale exists today.
That might be the case.
But I use some dimensions both of structural dimensions for mass timber, but also dimensions of typical growing racks at current vertical farms, which the largest now is in New Jersey, and it's basically a warehouse, nondescript warehouse in the suburbs. You wouldn't even know what was in there, but it was the largest producer of indoor aquaponic like lettuce in the world. It's a huge thing. It's actually super sciencey. The inside looks really cool.
How tall is it?
It's a one-story warehouse.
I'd be surprised at more.
Yeah, which is more speaking to the cost of real estate than this. So am I trying to replicate what they do there, but in a way that's more visual and more urban? Here is more like a couple of 40,000 square foot vertical farms that exist throughout the world. And there's one in Jackson Hole that's pretty cool. It's on the side of a parking garage, because of course it snows 12 months a year in Wyoming. So that's a huge need why they built this little vertical farm there, but it has or boasts an efficiency of 100 times more product than would be if it was grown outside, kind of thing. And exists in a similar way where it's a city-owned property that is at once a vocational school for people, but also a place where people are getting food cheaply as community members. So.
It's a very compelling new building type and attempting to solve a problem. I'm curious about the programming of that piece and the people who occupy it, how you collect the food, how you bring that down to the ground plane and bring it through to the markets. That's all, kind of another layer and colorful piece of witnessing this, farming that's happening inside a building. So is there a program in the building, or is there kind of a procession or sequence or anything like that about collecting the food that's kind of celebrated?
As I mentioned briefly, the light wall creating like a donut shape, so we have a cyclical flow, and I've made it so stuff comes off of one freight elevator, it's seeded, it grows, moves all the way around, and it's harvested and goes into the other elevator, goes down to a basement level. So these racks, they're on wheels, so the racks move themselves. So you plant 5 racks every day, and then you move them 5 places and plant a new set of 5 racks, and then after 30 days or 60 days or 80 days, however long that plant takes to be ready to harvest, it's moved around and ready to harvest. But then I have all 4 of these connected at basement level tunnels, which I have one little one sort of cartooned in here with some big crates and people moving around, but then move underneath the market to a distribution area, which is in the podium underneath these 2 blocks. So in the same space as the market, like connecting underneath the hill at Packard Street. So we can get trucks coming in like Green Street, filling up, and then exiting on Utah.
Great project, really beautifully done. Getting back to Jana's point, this idea, right now there's this sort of cleanliness of edge between the very things. And if you sort of think about ecotones, which are those transition zones of complexity and diversity, and is there a way to create those between your building types and even in the landscape between the farming area and the market, right? To sort of add that diversity and complexity, and then think about ecotones that are also, that people are part of, right? And that they are diverse cultural zones that connect these things. And it just possibly a way to think about complicating and making it a little bit more messy, what is clearly beautiful, but something to think about.
I guess with that, I've been thinking about the opportunities for learning and, all the facts and things you showed us about, what the amount of spaces it takes to grow food and, how so many people don't understand if you live in a city where things come from and what the tree is that a fruit came from. And wondering how you've thought about those opportunities and if there's a school that's part of it or that piece of it. It kind of goes also to the programming question that Chris asked, but another part of it.
Yeah, so I always assume that there's going to be sort of loads of educational training going on throughout all the different pieces of the program. I had set aside these larger pieces in the center of the first floor of the market that are underneath the Packet Street Bridge as a sort of teaching kitchen. So that's one aspect there. I also set aside this pavilion at the end of the demonstration garden, between the demonstration gardens. That's the second floor on Green Street as community space. So instead of sort of profitable retail space, that's meeting rooms and basically flexible space where all this stuff could happen. And then surely there's some sort of vocational training that goes on with the farming, because our urban farmers aren't going to be people from outside coming into the city to farm. It's going to be people that live in the city learning, a new way of producing food.
It also might be like the farmer who lives next to his land or his or her land, with the people living in the buildings might be the farmers, I don't know. But I also wonder about the children growing up in those spaces and if that's part of rethinking, if we're trying to reseed a future that takes these things more seriously, there's an opportunity to validate it through education.
Very nicely done, Eric. It's always fascinating to be there at the very beginning and then magically see these projects appear at the end. I wanted to very briefly go back to building image, because ultimately when you create an impetus for this to actually happen in Baltimore, you're going to have developers and other interested parties who are going to be intensely interested in marketing the project and introducing an entirely new building type that's going to have a huge impact on how they perceive a certain part of the city. The elevations are somewhat reminiscent of Jose Luis Sert's architecture in Cambridge for me. I can't tell you exactly why, but some of the dormitory buildings and the infrastructure that he created there. But, so the litmus test would be for your developer friends who you're going to be working with for 7 years in this, can you reduce this project to a signature concept drawing that's going to be the icon that tells everybody that this new building type has arrived in the city? And it's a really fascinating problem. I would just say it's sort of the spiritual and human dimension of introducing this new and powerful building type, this system, which is a very exciting proposition, which I can't quite see yet in your elevations. It's not quite, in all the comments about the messiness of the natural world and all of that and interacting with the housing, I think are all very much to the point. So I would encourage you to get your hands dirty in this and think about how this new building type becomes a powerful new partner in the city.
Just really quickly to go along with that, when you do that drawing, pack the people in. I was in Madrid earlier this fall, and the markets were the social centers. This was the place to be. The streets were crowded, but man, we had to fight our way into the market. And the food looked extraordinary. It was the best food in the city. And people were, I mean, literally had to fight our way in. We had to push people aside just to walk through. So, you know, looking at your lovely rendering there, I would take the number of people times 20 just to really get across the idea that I think is one of the potent ideas here, that you have made a social setting to build community around food. So that you're not only going to be sustaining life with food, but you're really going to be sustaining community, because, man, people bond over food, and, you know, we can look to Europe for the huge success of the markets. Just, you know, unbelievable. I'm picturing this just swarming with people and food.
There's a fair amount of literature that says we need to leave about 50% of the earth untouched or we're in big trouble. I have a feeling these are going to be fairly energy intensive, but this may be a way that we can grow our food without destroying the nature that we need to leave in wilderness. You know, because it's just too complicated for us to manage. It's just beyond our abilities. You know, but so this kind of thing may be a future that's going to happen.
Actually, on Friday, picked up the New York Times, and there was on the cover a photograph of a portion of Brazil that's been cleared by fire in order to make for more agricultural land. In this last year, according to the New York Times, which I believe is reporting real, true knowledge, I believe in the New York Times. It reported that last year alone that the Brazilian government permitted the burning of 3,700 square miles of the Amazon rainforest in order to create land for agriculture. And this, to me, is a crime against humanity. And this is clearly an alternative for that, although probably at the moment not accessible to the Brazilian mindset. There ought to be a complaint lodged in a court in The Hague or something. I want to thank Carl for scheduling this at the end of the day, because like most of the crits throughout the semester, every single time I got together with Eric, I felt a certain hunger after this discussion of food. This is the appropriate amuse-bouche for this afternoon. It's got us our mouths amused and ready to go. I think that's quite lovely. The Mercado San Miguel in Madrid is someplace you need to go visit. That sounds like the place you probably were. And it is the greatest fetishization of food. I can say the word fetish, but I can't say the other word. Of food that you could possibly imagine. And the presentation, I think Maddie hit it straight on the head, is that there's just, food is presented in a way that you just feel like you could just graze in there for days. Eric's background is clearly in food. He was a butcher, chef. I think we actually saw some of his product in one of those slides that had his brand on it. A prosciutto, I think, or something.
It's a pork belly.
Pork belly? Okay. So he really knows about food. He started off knowing about food, but then he kept going back up the supply chain to find more and more about it. And I really think that that's what makes this incredibly compelling, is that it wasn't just relying upon what I know, but it was using the educational experience to fill in what I don't know, and using this project to do that, which is kind of what education's about. It's not about what you already know, it's about what you don't know and figuring out how to learn about that. And also just kind of mention that, that like Adon's thesis before, we got to a point where the committee suggested to Eric that the project had gotten so big and so complex that what he needed to make were a series of diagrams, and those series of little axon diagrams at the very beginning I think were very helpful in kind of communicating the intent, but that he needed to really devote focus to one of the buildings, the one he actually started with to critique, which was the market. So noticing, as many of you have, that the other buildings are maybe more diagrammatic, maybe more anemic in comparison to the market building is perhaps, in this instance, to his credit that he chose to develop the market so that we can look at the market. And I think that also accounts for why the market is not yet open for business. It's stocking its food, Maddie. It will look like the Mercado San Miguel. He wanted to show us the architecture. It will look like that at the appropriate point. I also just mentioned that the starting point for this thesis was actually last semester in Architecture 601, where Eric and Trevor Wood, who's in the back of the room, won the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture Timber in the City competition for high-rise timber building in New York, and they won against, I don't know, 900 entries to this from around the world or something, some huge number. They came in first place. We're really proud of both of you guys for doing that. The last thing, and yes, and Professor Noonan and his very calm, charismatic guidance there got him through. Peter is a wonder. I just want to comment on something that we were worried about about a week and a half ago, and I don't know why the hell we were. But we were worried about the presentation. Not about the drawings, not about the graphics, because we could see that was developing, but we're really concerned that Eric really needed to put this together with a kind of emphatic oomph to it. And there was this whole kind of discussion about, Eric, you can't get up there and do the monotone and whatnot. You didn't really change your pattern of voice very much. You slowed down a lot. That was really good. But what you did is really interesting. I want to point it out because there are a lot of younger folks in the room, in the back of the room, is that it's really common when students get up and present, they'll present things like the janitor tour of the building. Well, here's the front door, and then you go here, and then you go there. Or they'll present a project like it's my struggle. I did this, and then Peter said no, and then I did that, and Brian said that stupid idea, and then Carl told me to do this, and it's always the worst thing, you blame my Carl. And how refreshing it was to use the story of food to get us all into this project and to tell us what the big dilemma was. You told us what the problem, you told us what the problem was, and then you proposed the solution in, I think, a very elegant way. And to me, while this is perhaps the beginning, Jamie, of the answer to your question about the drawing that is for the marketers and whatnot, for me, the thesis was that series of axon diagrams that really explain the way that conceptually you were thinking about weaving these things together in a very rigorous way. So I gotta say, storytelling ain't dead. It's really a great art form, and you did a fantastic job of it, and congratulations on a really beautiful thesis. Thank you.